Good morning, everybody. Nice to see so many people attending and greeting and saying good morning in the chat. My name is Joe Long. I'm Director of Practice and Innovation at Scottish Autism, and welcome to this seminar on inclusive governance and meaningful decision-making at Scottish Autism, which is hosted by Scottish Autism and a consortium of autistic-led organisations who have made up the inclusive governance team. That's Autistic Mutual Aid Society Edinburgh, Autism Rights Group Highland, and the National Autistic Task Force. A couple of things just about the running of the seminar. There are separate Q&A, question and answer, and chat functions. The Q&A is for the session at the end, where all the speakers will be given the questions that have arisen throughout the seminar. If you could indicate if you want to ask a question, if one occurs to you throughout the course of the presentation, whether you'd like the team to answer it by text or verbally when we get to the Q&A section, that will help us make sure that we use different mediums to answer and make this as accessible and inclusive as possible for those attending. So, if you put text or voice or verbal before your question, we'll know how to answer it. And as I say, the Q&A and the chat functions are separate in this. It's great that people are greeting each other and saying good morning. It's helpful for the speakers if we minimize chat during the actual presentations, because otherwise pop-ups come up and that can be quite difficult for those trying to focus on what they're saying. So I'll just say those things to start with, and also the seminar will be available online afterwards for those that want to kind of take their time to engage with it and process it afterwards as well, and we'll share the presentations too. If my clicker is working, yes, that's the program for this morning. I'll make a brief introduction, and then the inclusive governance team will be presenting the work that they've done, advising Scottish Autism on how we improve inclusivity in governance and decision-making throughout the organisation, and will introduce themselves as we go along. And then the Q&A at the end will be there for a broader discussion in which we hope everybody can contribute and be involved in the manner that they see fit. So I'm just going to start by giving a really brief introduction to the ways, the things that led Scottish Autism to think about inclusivity and inclusive governance, and ultimately to commission the team to do the work that they're going to be presenting today. I'm Director of Practice and Innovation at Scottish Autism, but it's really important I think in any context in which we're thinking about a shift in power and acknowledgement of where power has historically sat and influence has historically sat, that I acknowledge my position in the picture. I think it's a really important thing to do. My background is chiefly as a practitioner, as a support worker in services supporting autistic people and people with learning disabilities, for some on and off for some 30 years now, since I was at school actually, but also have a research background as a social anthropologist, and I've been with Scottish Autism since 2013, mainly leading practice-focused research programs, but I recently became a director, and it's really important to acknowledge that gives me a certain level of privilege and power, and all those roles have. They mean I see things through a certain lens, and I have to acknowledge that as we go into a sort of meaningful dialogue about how we change things. I'm not autistic and I'm a professional, and both those things will affect the way that I see things and perceive things and how the terms on which we speak. Scottish Autism really started thinking about greater inclusion. In 2011, there was a process called the Public Service Improvement Framework, through which organisations and public bodies started thinking about what they do and what they could improve. And as long ago as 2011, what was then called user participation was flagged up as something our organisation needed to do better, or to prioritise development of. This was a time when we called those we support service users. We don't now. This was before I joined the organisation, but when I joined in 2013, various initiatives were underway. Development of service forums which were inclusive of supported people, looking to make people's reviews of their service more inclusive. And when I joined, we started up a group of kind of research projects that were really about capturing some of that work, thinking about what could we do better, and evidence doing better in terms of including meaningfully the people that we support, the autistic people we support in our services. in decisions about the services that they receive in their day-to-day lives. And in 2015, to that end, Scottish Autism signed something called the Charter for Involvement that was created by the National Involvement Network here in Scotland, which lays out kind of aspirations for and better inclusion in decision making. And the other things were going on in the early 2010s that were sort of fed into our thinking on this. There was this greater emphasis on what's then called user participation in health and social care services. How did people who accessed and used services have a say in how they were run? The growing autistic self-advocacy movement was critically engaging with practice models and with research to say to make the case for better inclusion of autistic people, the growing traction for the neurodiversity paradigm, all of which had been around for a while, but which was probably gaining more traction and understanding at that time. And an advocacy movement really focused on social models of disability and human rights, which were all starting to feed into our thinking as service providers and support providers. And there were critical questions around research at the time, exemplified by the Future Made Together report that was done in 2013 by UCL, asking autistic people and their families and professionals where the focuses of research should be. A lot of research at the time was very clinical. It was very focused on neurobiology, whereas in fact, autistic people who took part in that process said they needed to see much more on services and the services they received. And I think there was a sort of dialogue between how research was making itself, trying to be more inclusive and participatory in some sections, and services were having the same kinds of discussions. So what we did was allow our kind of research and practice to kind of talk to one another really, and do very practice-focused research, looking at how we did service forums, how the school assembly was changing to be more inclusive, looking at creative projects we were doing, individual review processes. How did we in all those places validate different ways of communicating, of expressing choice, and what were the kind of pointers for practice that came out of that? And in doing that, in trying to make our research more participatory and inclusive of the voices of people we supported and be led by those people, that helped us think about how we did the same for our practice. We talk a lot about this term voice at Scottish Autism. That was drawing on ideas of pupil voice that were developed in schools, but it had that kind of double resonance for us really of different means of communication, that people's voices may look and sound very different depending on their preferred means of communication, but also of having a say, of being involved, being included. That kind of democratic voice was a kind of part of our thinking. And we talked about participation, involvement, and all of these things were about not just understanding that autistic people had different ways of communicating that we supported, but that those means should be harnessed in meaningful decision making about the support they received. And we recognized a number of themes. We'll share the slides, I won't go through them all, but they were really about how we preserve these authenticity of these voices, how different kinds of voices and ways of communicating needed to make their way into things like service planning and support plans, which were very script-centered documents, how we used media that were meaningful to people, whether that was video diaries, video, art, poetry, people having an ownership of process. You could have symbols all over the walls and visual timetables, but were people involved in saying what went into those and so on? And did people have copies of their support plans and the documents that came out of their planning? Did they have a concrete output, or did they sit in an office somewhere else belonging essentially to the team, the support staff team? So all of those things we thought about, the spaces we used for forums and school assemblies and creative projects, how we listened to one another, and how the benefits of autonomy and responsibility of our supported people in those spaces. So we did a lot of that thinking, and when we revised our practice model a few years ago, we made sure that rather than the traditional practice model, which was sort of naming a kind of deficit-based view of autism and communication as a sort of difficulty or a deficit, we said, well, what's our practice imperative? Our practice imperative is to understand different forms of communication, to listen to people's voice and choice. Communication to what end was the question we asked, and made sure that, you know, voice choice is really visible in our practice model. And as we changed our practice models, or we sought to change it, we also undertook a kind of inclusive survey process that we developed for different means of communication, through which we could ask whether we were doing that. You know, are our spaces enabling, or is there sensory stress? Are we communicating in the right way? What are relationships like with between support staff and those we support? Are people involved in their support planning? You know, those are the questions we asked. And we had a kind of individualized and adapted process, which made reference to concrete services that people received, concrete staff teams, allowed space for a discussion about the support people received, and then moved to kind of a rating system based on those discussions. And you know, we used all different kinds of communication. Some people used symbols, which they moved around in a kind of talking maths fashion. Other people completed it in a written way. Some people had a verbal discussion. But the whole point, you know, our sort of mantra was that we should engage a representative sample of people we support meaningfully, rather than engage everybody in the organization in a kind of tick box exercise and have a survey that was actually filled in by support staff or family members. We took on average about 8 or 9 hours with each person to make sure we got their means of communication right, that we or what we thought was right, that we allowed for these individualizations, adaptations, allowed for processing time, doing it in several sessions if necessary. So there was a move really to ask, are we doing what we say on the tin, sort of thing, and doing it in a meaningful and representative way. We have a couple more pieces of research which are currently being undertaken, which Dori's going to talk about in her talk, but we've got 2 PhD studentships looking at autistic communication preferences and the inclusion of the people we support in the wider autistic community. So I'll flag those up. Dori's going to talk about them more, but I'll just put it out there that this kind of research and practice dialogue was really important as we tried to use more inclusive and participatory researches. We shared our work in practice resources for everybody to use in the organisation. We had workshops, it informed our practice model. We shared it at a staff conference. And in 2020, we had a staff conference during the pandemic online where we reviewed all of this work, went over it. Our supported people presented and were part of these discussions, but we also had board members, and some fairly new members of our leadership team were present as well. And we asked, you know, is this voice and participation agenda really reflected at organizational service level? And we had to admit that it was not in the way that we would want it to be, that we had a lot more work to do. So at that point, we put out a competitive tender to ask for the wider community, the wider autistic community, to advise us on how we improve our inclusive governance, our inclusion at all levels. And that tender was won by a consortium of the National Autistic Task Force, Maze and ARG, who then went about the inclusive governance project and report, which I will then hand over to that team to describe and introduce. So I'll hand over now, I think, to Leo in the first instance, who's going to talk more about that project.
Hello, so I'm Leo. I'm a member of the project team and a member of a maze. I'm going to run through an outline of the project, how it came about, an overview, touch on our exploratory meetings and desk research, and then I will hand over to Josh, another member of our team, who will go through stakeholder engagement and take it from there. So who were we? Well, we're Amaze, the Autistic Mutual Aid Society, based in Edinburgh, also cover Lothians and Fife, an autistic people's organisation. ARG, based in the Highlands, the Autism Rights Group, also an autistic people's organisation focused around advocacy for all autistic people. And finally, Nat, the National Autistic Task Force, which is actually a UK-wide, the previous two were Scotland-based, is a UK-wide autistic-led organisation which seeks to draw on collective knowledge and the experience of autistic adults. So how the project came about, as has been mentioned, the tender was put out. It explicitly stated that it was seeking input from autistic consultants and autistic-led organisations to support Scottish Autism in developing and delivering a change programme whose aim was to create an inclusive governance approach at board and operational level. A group of us got together from Nat, ARG and Maze and agreed to work on the tender. We felt this was a huge opportunity to make a real impact in the lives of our members and the wider autistic community here in Scotland, and a unique opportunity as a project. We met frequently, developing and agreed an extremely detailed plan centered in part around a human rights-based approach. As individuals, we all came to it with a very wide array of skills and experience. And this meant that working together, we could play to our strengths. And Yo kindly from that agreed to lead the project. The tender included things like a Gantt chart, costings, detailed project plan, as I've mentioned, and was accepted by Scottish Autism. And once the contract was signed, we moved forward. Here you can see there is a simple time table laying out the project, our main areas of focus, and the proposed timescales. The exploratory meetings were where the members of the team discuss things like what various groups' understanding of inclusion and inclusiveness and governance, and what inclusive governance might look like or might be. The desk research at this stage was relatively basic in that it was compiling lists of organizations across sectors and of various sizes that we felt might be useful case studies. Those were then reduced down using various criteria, for example, organizations that were of similar size or turnover to Scottish Autism. The second half of phase one was then moving into the case studies, which involved much more detailed analysis of the organizations to make a second cut and reduce that down to ones that we really wanted to focus on. And that's when we, for example, met with those organizations or people from those organizations, so we could understand how they did various things like engaging with their members, or how certain aspects of their governance structure worked, as well as looking at, for example, governance structures that they might have online. The stakeholder engagement was also worked on and refined and broadened beyond the senior leadership team and the board to the wider leadership team, supported individuals, the wider autistic community. Stage two was then engaging with the stakeholder groups, working in a co-productive manner with them to develop an understanding and work up our suggestions before then working on the final report, which drew a huge amount of information together. So the exploratory meetings, this was the stage at which, as I've said, we met with the Scottish Autism's board, the senior leadership team, the wider leadership team, and talked about what did people think of when we used the term inclusive. How would you make something inclusive? What did it look like to be inclusive? And also, what wasn't inclusive, because it's good to know those things too. What maybe approaches people had that they'd come across that weren't as inclusive, and therefore what barriers could be in the way that they'd experienced, but also that they might think of during those processes. And then how inclusive did they presently feel Scottish Autism's governance was, and what would people like to see changed? I think this was a really a great stage for us. Sorry, it helped to really broaden our focus beyond just the kind of senior leadership team focus. We had a lot of very individual or small meetings with the various stakeholders. And I think the key was that everyone was really honest and thoughtful in their responses. And that really helped inform the project going forwards. So the desk research, this is a brief explanation of the desk research. We started off by reviewing Scottish Autism's policies, internal documentation, brief scan of academic literature, scoping of organisations, as I've said, a summary of information on the key organisations that we then wanted to look at, looking at how they actually worked in detail, and how they put their inclusive ideas into practice. The desk research that we did, these are the organizations that we focused on. They were as broad as we could get. They had a lot of lessons. They were chosen for different reasons. MenCap, for example, was chosen as a contrast to the more inclusive approaches that we looked at in other organizations. Yeah, there you go. I will now, I think, oh yes, here we go. We organized them into various themes, and it was through those themes that we analyzed the various organizations and what worked and what didn't. And I'm very sorry, I think I may have run over, so I need to apologize to Josh, who I'm handing over to now.
All right. Am I here? I think I am. Yeah, there I am. Thanks, Leo. Don't worry about that. We always overrun a bit. So I'm going to be talking about stakeholder engagement, and I'm going to wait for my little buttons to come up. There we are. Do they work? Yes, they do. Okay, well, we engage with a variety of stakeholders in a variety of ways. We did a survey targeted at the staff, wider autistic community, supported individuals, and the families of supported individuals. That was mostly online. We also did focus groups, again, mostly online. Some of these focus groups were publicised through Scottish Autism. Argon and Maze also did a focus group for our own members, because we've got a wide autistic membership, so they're an ideal group to talk to. We also, at Autscape, an annual conference for autistic people, that's a whole bunch of autistic people to get together once a year. So we talked to a bunch of people there as well. That's very useful. And of course, there are people we can't easily reach by these methods. So we also had to arrange meetings with particular supported individuals. I keep saying service users. Yeah, we had to make special arrangements to gather their views and to form an impression of their experience and how they saw the situation. Okay, next one. Okay, on accessibility, we made some explanatory materials for the so that stakeholders knew what we were doing, and we did that in a variety of ways. Keep losing my buttons, I can't see them. There they are. So the survey questions were reviewed by some autistic people just to make sure that they made sense and were accessible. People understood what we were asking. The online form asked about any accessibility adjustments that people might need. And the focus groups offered autistic accessibility adjustments routinely. It's standard practice when autistic people meet online to treat, for example, anything in the chat with an equal kind of status as anything sort of said verbally. Indeed, some of these focus groups, some of it was all talking, other ones it was just a lot of tip tapping. People didn't really speak, they just chatted in the text, which is great. And sometimes it was a mixture. But engagement was good, generally pretty high. All right, yes, so we'll here's just a few examples of some of the easy read versions of the materials. I'll give you a few seconds on each one. And the next one. And another one. And we wanted everybody to see a picture of us, make us a bit more real. And that's important for some people particularly, and also letting everybody know that we're all autistic. That's an important bit of information so that people understand the perspective of the project. And it might even be important for engagement, as some people, for trust and engagement, some people might only want to engage if they know we're autistic, if they've had bad experiences in the past or something like that. So that's why we did that. Okay, I'll talk a bit about the bespoke interviews that we did, where we visited services. I think we visited about, I don't know, 4 or 5 services. So each interview involved prior discussion with the staff and family members in order to gather background information so we could set up the interview properly. That was the most efficient method we could think of to make it work, because we can't. The restrictions of the project meant we couldn't arrange, multiple visits over the period of a year or something, which would have been ideal, but there's just not the resources for that. So yes, so we talked about how to communicate with service users and how best to use the time. Also, while we were there, while we had parents or staff, while we were talking to them, we also gathered their views at the same time, because that was just an efficient way to do it, and that was really helpful. Got a lot of useful information that way. We used Boardmaker, which is a standard practice within Scottish Autism. It's a bit of software that allows you to make pictures and diagrams and things for communication. That worked fine with one of the service users, didn't work so well with some of the others, but that's absolutely fine. Doesn't matter. We didn't want to be rigid about it, despite our being autistic ourselves, but there we go. We just abandoned any methods of communication that weren't working and just followed the service user's lead, and that seemed to work very well in most cases. We gathered data, not just by direct interaction with the service user, but supported individual, direct interaction with them, but also by observing how they communicated with their support staff and with their environment, and the use of autistic empathy. One advantage of having autistic people go and visit services is that our own experience and our own lived experience and knowledge of other autistic people, we can very quickly pick up on some things that maybe other people wouldn't pick up on, particularly, for example, sensory issues. And it was very gratifying to be able to very quickly and easily give quite a lot of useful feedback that maybe wouldn't have been got in other ways, especially about the sensory environment. So that was interesting. Yes, and I feel we've got to be cautious about not projecting, but I felt we could have insight into the perspectives of some service users. Sorry, support individuals, keep doing it. I beg your pardon. Right. We had limited, inevitably with a project like this, there's limited time and opportunity to develop relationships, as I've said. It was in the aftermath of COVID as well, which made things difficult. And indeed luck. I mean, when we showed up on one place, the service user we went to see was asleep. So there we go. Can't be helped. Yeah, we would have loved to have met more service users, but supported individuals. But it still worked fine. We still got good information. Right. Last slide. Okay. I'll give you a moment to look at this. This is just a breakdown of the proportions of the categories of people we consulted. Biggest one, senior staff and board, as you'd expect. But also we got a good amount of information from lots of other stakeholder groups as well, including critically the yellow bit, the supported individuals. Give you a second to look at that. There we go. Don't know how it is for time. Let's move on to the next thing.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Yo Dunn from the National Autistic Task Force, which, as Leo said, tries to bring to bear autistic collective knowledge, and we focus very particularly on the interests of individuals, such as some of those supported by Scottish Autism, who may be less able to advocate on their own behalf. So I'm going to turn now to talking about not just what we did and how we did it, but what actually came out of the project, what our recommendations were. But I do need to start by putting in place some building blocks for explaining that. So what did we end up concluding autistic governance is? Well, this is a diagram, a word cloud that comes from data that came from those initial exploratory conversations around what individuals within Scottish Autism felt that inclusive governance meant. We also engaged with some of the academic literature around inclusion. And in particular, we were influenced by Colin Brander's identification of three important elements of inclusive governance. One is that the need for capital, for people to have a stake in an organisation. We were also influenced by, we're also leaning towards the possibility of thinking about both binding and non-binding influence on decision-making processes, and that being important to inclusion. And finally, we also understood from that model that accountability is an important element of inclusion. We also decided very early on that we didn't see inclusive governance purely as a matter of what goes on at the level of the board, at the very top of the organisation. Things like setting strategic priorities and financial planning. We saw that as important, but not the only place that inclusion was needed in terms of governance. We also thought about inclusion in leadership of the organisation at a level of individual care and support services, and indeed at an individual level, people's inclusion in key decision making about their own lives, where to go, how they are supported. And we saw inclusive governance as something that involved looking at how autistic voice could become more influential in all of those areas. So at the end of the project, we had, through these processes and co-production, 4 overarching recommendations. These were a representation in governance, developing agency and leadership, values and recruitment, and service autonomy and accountability. And in the rest of my presentation, I'm going to set out for you in detail, or in as much detail as we have time for this morning, those recommendations and the specific mechanisms that we put forward as ways of furthering those. But just before I get into that, it's important to introduce a concept that may well be familiar to some of you, but perhaps not others. And it's a concept that we realized was really fundamental to our approach. And that's the concept of autistic space. So autistic space is a concept that has developed over many years in the autistic community. An autistic space was defined collectively, but documented in a paper by Martijn Dekker as any virtual or real world space that is shared by several autistic people, designed for or adapted for autistic processing and values autistic ways of functioning. A space which is importantly designed and controlled by autistic people. By and for autistic people, where autistic needs and culture take priority, and a space in which being and acting autistic is acceptable and accepted. When we found ourselves needing to explain the concept of autistic space to those not familiar with it, we also found that it was helpful to describe some of the common features which tend to arise in autistic spaces. And they include that non-spoken forms of communication are respected, common, and valued. That sensory sensitivities are respected, and usually autistic norms apply. For example, I've been sat round in a room with other autistic people in autistic space having a chat as the sun goes down and night falls, and the room becomes darker and darker, and nobody bothers to turn any lights on because we're perfectly happy in that environment without feeling the need for it to be really bright. It also tends to have the feature that not interacting is a valid, respected choice. People are not coerced or pressurized to interact if they don't wish to do so. It's perfectly acceptable to be present in the space without interacting. That communication tends towards containing a greater informational content and less small talk and chit chat, where participants are valued for their knowledge and their contribution rather than their social status or how they dress or look. Tolerance and explanation of social and communication errors and missteps is more normal. It's generally normal to forewarn others about changes, to do exactly what you say you're going to do, and to provide detailed information about what's expected of others. It's socially acceptable to ask very direct questions and expect an honest, direct answer, like how long are we going to be talking for and when are you going to be quiet? It's considered unreasonable to expect someone else to know what you think or feel without telling them. And so all of those features and more commonly occur in autistic space. And the concept of autistic space is very important and influential in many of our recommendations. However, I'm going to break my presentation at this point so we can have a brief comfort break. We will be back in 10 minutes at 10:50. So if everyone can be back by then, please, I will continue to explain in detail what our recommendations are. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope everyone's managed to get back. So I'm now going to describe the 4 overarching recommendations that we have developed through the Inclusive Governance Project and how we see those applying to Scottish autism. So the first recommendation is around representation in governance. And of course, that is the most obvious form of inclusive governance. But in the course of our desk research, we came across and decided to adopt a set of questions around this, which were developed by an American organization called the ARC. And here they are. Diversity. Asking the question, who is in the room when decisions are being made? Looking at access. Can everyone get inside the room where decisions are being made, or even the building? And the room and the building here, of course, are metaphorical, not literal. Equity. Who built the room? Who received an invitation? And inclusion. Does everyone feel comfortable and welcome in the room? And we came gradually over the course of the project to the view that one of the key ways in which we should recommend Scottish autism progressed representation of autistic voices was through collaboration. We felt that there were opportunities for the wider autistic community, and particularly for representatives of autistic people's organisations, rather than random individual autistic people, to work collaboratively with individuals supported by Scottish Autism, and through that collaboration to progress greater representation both of the supported individuals and of the wider autistic community in Scottish Autism's governance. So these questions and thoughts led us to some really concrete recommendations about how Scottish Autism should increase autistic representation in their governance. We looked at representation on the board. And we started out by recognizing that before you can look at representation on the board, you need to know what representation there already is. And not just of autistic people, but across a range of forms of diversity. And so we recommended that Scottish Autism should start collecting and publishing data on the representation of various groups on its board collectively and over time amongst its senior and wider leadership teams. We also recommended that Scottish Autism should set a minimum level of representation and a target number of autistic people to be present on the board. Much to some people's surprise, we did not ultimately recommend that Scottish Autism should seek to make its board majority autistic. And the reasons for that are quite varied and discussed in depth in our full report, but essentially around not recognising Scottish Autism's role as being the organisation that it is, and recognising the danger to smaller grassroots autistic people's organisations of Scottish Autism becoming essentially a rival autistic people's organisation when that was not in fact its origin. We also proposed that if autistic people were going to be represented on the board should change how it worked and focus much less on having lengthy meetings entirely in speech, and shift those ways of working to approaches that might be more accessible, providing papers in advance in accessible formats such as easy read, modifying how meetings were undertaken, involving different systems like pairs of board members looking at papers together and discussing it in text or in speech amongst themselves as a pair, and then sharing that with a wider group. We also felt that Scottish Autism should, moving forward, look towards having shared leadership, and that they should appoint 2 paid autistic co-chairs, at least one of whom should be a supported individual, to work alongside the CEO, at least when Scottish Autism is engaging in campaigning and representational activities, when the organisation can be taken as speaking for or representing autistic people. We felt strongly that Scottish Autism should, when doing that, speak with a majority autistic voice. And we also encourage the organisation to look at whether the co-chairs might also be able to work alongside the CEO in a broader range of the organisation's functions. Now, when we concluded that we should not recommend a majority autistic board, that raised a question of how then we could ensure a genuine shift of power towards autistic people. We looked as a counterexample at certain large charities who have forums for individuals that they purport to represent, where those forums are mere talking shops who are then largely ignored. And so we looked at how we could propose something better. And we recommended an autistic advisory panel. And for this to involve supported individuals from within Scottish Autism and also representatives of autistic disabled persons organisations from around Scotland. And the idea of this autistic advisory panel was that rather than being controlled by Scottish Autism staff, that Scottish Autism should facilitate the logistics, but allow the autistic advisory panel to become autistic space, to run itself, to work in autistic friendly ways. And we also felt it very important that the autistic advisory panel should have real power and influence. So we recommended that they should have a mandate to oversee service quality, to make decisions and recommendations about what Scottish Autism should consider quality in its care and support services. We recommended that the Autistic Advisory Panel should review nominations to the board of Scottish Autism and make recommendations about them. And we also recommended the Autistic Advisory Panel should have direct input into job descriptions for the recruitment of staff for Scottish Autism. Finally, in this area, we also recommended that the organisation as a whole should undertake a broader, inclusive strategic priority setting process, and that should involve a much broader consultation, perhaps periodically, perhaps every other year, into which Scottish Autism would enable a very broad range of people, and particularly autistic people, including the wider autistic community, to have direct input and influence over the organisation's strategic policies and recommend to the board what should be adopted, and that the board would have to explain any decision not to adopt those recommendations. And finally, in this area, we recommended the formation of a diversity task force within the organisation, involving Scottish Autism staff becoming diversity champions and looking within their sections of the organisation at how to further inclusion and diversity across the organisation. But that was only the first of our overarching recommendations. The second question that immediately arose from that was, well, if we're proposing that individuals supported by Scottish Autism should participate in these ways, including in quite significant and influential ways in Scottish Autism's decision-making as an organisation, are they all ready to do that? Do they have the skills? Have they been supported to develop the confidence to be able to undertake those roles? So we realised that there was a need to develop agency and leadership. And from knowledge and experience, and also some of the stakeholder engagement, we realised that it is relatively common for autistic people who've experienced high levels of care and support throughout our lives to end up in adult life having never made a decision for ourselves, and maybe not even recognising that we could make decisions for ourselves. So we felt very strongly that this process needed to start at a really fundamental level by encouraging Scottish Autism right across the organisation to embed the active support and development of individuals' decision-making about their own lives through supported decision-making and active teaching of the concept of agency, being able to control one's own life and make one's own decisions as an adult. And that for those who wished to do so, they could further develop these skills and confidence around participating in wider society as citizens, through, for those who wish to do so, becoming involved in service level decision making, developing further leadership skills, and moving on, for those who wish to do so, into decision making at a regional level, membership of the Autistic Advisory Panel that we were recommending, and ultimately to perhaps submitting an application to become a member of the board or one of the co-chairs. So how do we see this working? Well, we feel that it's vital to embed in support planning processes at a really fundamental level that every individual supported by Scottish Autism should be supported towards increasing control and say over their own lives, being supported to develop their understanding of their status as adults and being able to move towards making more of their own decisions, having a greater say in decisions made about them. And that would involve really specific work across the organisation on developing supported decision making and working with guardians and families and staff and supported individuals to further that goal to enable people to have greater control over their lives. And that alongside that, Scottish Autism should develop an explicit leadership development programme for supported individuals who could choose or request to undertake it, and that leadership development programme would support and actively teach skills around representing others, participating in governance and how organisations are run. Our third overarching recommendation was around values and recruitment. And in this area, we realised that there needed to be a really fundamental shift of power. and that support staff within Scottish Autism currently saw themselves as working for Scottish Autism. But that ultimately, if autistic individuals supported by Scottish Autism were going to have a much greater say in their own lives, then that would need a reorientation for staff towards the concept of working for and accountable to those they support primarily, over and above the organisation. So this is a typical sort of model of care that a staff support person sees themselves as working for a support organisation and delivering care and support to the individual. And we wanted to turn that on its head and see a shift towards staff seeing the supported individual as their boss, not merely the recipient of their support. And we felt as part of that shift, there was a need for the organisation to work on ensuring that in its own decisions, autistic needs such as consistency of staff teams would be prioritised over the wider needs of the organisation or other influences. And we also felt that it would further the goal of inclusive governance to consider recruitment of staff for Scottish Autism explicitly from a neurodivergent talent pool. Again, drawing on that idea of collaboration across the autistic community. So some of the specific mechanisms that we recommended for this were that supported individuals should lead recruitment for their own staff, with the organisation's human resources department being advisory to the supported individual. That supported individuals should resume participating in interview panels and that they should be supported by the Autistic Advisory Panel in doing so. And that the format of those interviews could include more activity-based, doing job trial type tasks, which are known by research to be more accessible and fair to autistic applicants than traditional conversation style interviews, and might involve them, for example, doing an activity with a supported individual that they might support and then seeking feedback from that supported individual in relation to the recruitment decision. We also felt that this tied in with the Autistic Advisory Panel having significant input into job descriptions, interview questions at all levels, from employing a CEO to the most junior and temporary support worker. We also recommended that Scottish Autism should review its existing values and possibly concentrate less on getting them all to start with C and include things like equity and possibly diversity. And finally, a language use policy, which I just had to remind some of my colleagues about, including some changes to the language you use, using terminology such as non-speaking rather than non-verbal, and avoiding functioning labels such as high-functioning and low-functioning, which encourage assumptions and can be unhelpful. We also recommended the creation of staff and supported individual bubbles, where a small number of supported individuals and their staff would form a bubble, where the supported individuals would know all of the staff in that bubble, and whilst they would have the staff normally working with them being reasonably stable, when unavoidable absences occurred, staff from within that bubble would be able to cover, and that would produce much greater consistency of support for individuals, because we knew from our own lived experience, but it also came through very clearly in the co-production, how very important that stability is to the lives of autistic people who depend on support. That does pose a very significant challenge, which we have to acknowledge in the current recruitment crisis in care. That's very challenging, but nevertheless, we feel that it can in fact be an advantage in recruiting staff, not just a constraint. We also encourage Scottish Autism to consider prioritising neurodivergent traits in recruitment and to factor this into those job descriptions with help from the Autistic Advisory Panel. So focusing, for example, on directness and clarity of communication, consistency, and things of that nature rather than traditional people skills. And we also felt that Scottish Autism should deliberately set about diversifying the talent pool from whom it recruits by proactively seeking to recruit from underrepresented groups of all types, not merely autistic people, but in terms of other identities and diversity. Our final overarching recommendation was around service autonomy and accountability. We felt that there was a case to flatten some of the power in the organisation, to try to minimise the top-down control and ensure that services and local control over decision-making was located closer and further down the organisation, closer to the supported individuals. And we also felt that it was very important that services from Scottish Autism were connected to and rooted in their local communities. That Scottish Autism service should engage and collaborate with autistic DPOs around local campaigning that might be relevant for autistic people in the area. Should seek to recruit staff from local areas. Should look at, if they don't already, making a support offer to the local autistic community to involve engagement between Scottish Autism and their local community, and particularly to build bridges and links between Scottish Autism services and local autistic disabled persons organisations, including Scottish Autism supporting and facilitating the development of those organisations, whilst not controlling them, in areas of Scotland where they don't already exist. And we felt that it needed to be clear that centralised services within the organisation should be not in charge of, but serving those more localised services. We also felt the issue of accountability was extremely important. We knew from our desk research, from experience and knowledge of project members, and indeed from some of the stakeholder input, that the primary influencers on care and support services are the organisations who commission and pay for those services, generally the NHS and local authorities, and care inspectors to whom care services are accountable. But the difficulty with this from the perspective of inclusive governance is it means that services can very easily end up moulding themselves to what commissioners and inspectors want, rather than what actually meets the needs of the autistic people that they're supporting well. So we felt that alongside the inevitable and unavoidable influences from commissioners and inspectors, we needed to ensure there was clear autistic voice, and that supported individuals via the Autistic Advisory Panel should have a key role alongside those commissioners and inspectors in feeding in to the priorities that influence services. And that could be achieved by making sure that the issue of what Scottish Autism sees as quality is accountable to the Autistic Advisory Panel and not merely to commissioners and inspectors. And we also felt that there was a need to increase the autistic influence on service level decision making. And we felt that that could be done most effectively by shifting the model of reflection and coaching for service managers and possibly also for regional managers, so that instead of being coached and supported and indeed supervised by a more senior member of staff within Scottish Autism, that instead service managers who are making key decisions about the priorities within services should be coached by a team consisting of a supported individual from their service and a local representative from a autistic disabled persons organisation, and that pair of individuals should be supported by the Autistic Advisory Panel in that role. And we felt that by that mechanism it was possible to shift the priority setting and to create what we call soft forms of power and influence that would increase inclusive governance at the service level. So I hope if anyone has any questions about all of that, they will put their questions in the Q&A, and myself and colleagues and those from Scottish Autism who are here will be answering those very shortly. But before we get to that, I'm going to hand over to Dori to explain to you how Scottish Autism are going to take our recommendations forward.
Thank you, Yo. I've been Chief Executive at Scottish Autism for about 5 years now. Some of you who know me will know that I've had a very long career in social care, both in England and in Scotland. But that experience was very much grounded in housing association world. And it was in there that I really became passionate about supported individuals, residents, tenants becoming involved in the work of the organisations who were their landlords effectively. So I very much personally welcome this report. The process of moving towards implementing the recommendations won't be linear. So whilst as Chief Executive, and personally, I love a little bit of structure, we'll have to go with the flow a lot of the time. We'll make mistakes and we'll try again. My presentation will cover 2 areas, the lessons learned and the steps we're taking now. I want to kick off with culture change. I'm not sure we would even be thought about in such a radical way if we had tried to do this in-house. And I think the value of having independent consultants became really evident right from the start. As the leader of a large social care organisation, we'll have an embedded culture, as you would expect, and indeed subcultures across Scotland. And the benefits of having independent reviewers was really, in effect, challenging that. It was obvious, as Yo and Joe have said, that right from early on, we would need culture change to facilitate a shift in power. We know that culture change doesn't happen overnight, but did we know that it could also be so scary? I learned to look at things differently during the research project. And importantly, I recognised and I learned from Yo that I myself have loads of different support, from a window cleaner to car mechanics. But the difference is that I largely have autonomy about who I choose to use in those support roles. And that made me really sign up to the fact that we needed to make a shift of the power balance. And I think that's the scary bit from the top of Scottish Autism throughout the organisation. The people we support should be directing and have autonomy over their support. Autonomy in terms of where they live, who they live with, and who provides their support, all of which Yo has touched on. And that power shift is needed throughout Scottish Autism as we challenge how we govern at board level through to our practice on the front line in delivering services. We need to be, and anybody who's on a board right now will understand that we need to be confident that we meet our fiduciary responsibilities. When, let's face it, we've all been taught to do that, and our experience will be grounded in doing it right in a certain way. Doing it differently will feel inherently risky, whether that's about setting up an advisory panel or communicating reports in very different ways. Gatekeepers and their importance also became very obvious as we progressed through the project. We learned that it's important to understand who the key gatekeepers are. Obviously, we've got the board as a main gatekeeper, and we've got the senior leadership team and the wider leadership teams. They gatekeep what goes up to the board, and they gatekeep what goes down to the people delivering services. But let's not underestimate the gatekeeping role of frontline staff. And I think Yo alluded to this. They know the individuals we support, they know their parents, they know all the stakeholders that are involved. And it's really, really important to bring staff on side. And I think one of the things I learned when I was talking to our staff about inclusive governance is that the moment you mention governance, people think the board. They don't think it affects them. So perhaps one of the first things we need to do is reframe inclusive governance in a way that is understood by the people providing our support. Yo mentioned this, but the Care Inspectorate are also gatekeepers, and we need to engage with them on what we're doing. Yo gave me a really good analogy very early on when we were discussing the initial findings. And she said it's all very well saying you will take someone to vote, but if no one actually tells that person that there's an election on, what's the point in that good intention? We've had some quick wins. We were thinking about the role of our Centre for Practice Innovation, which is our knowledge hub. And its aim is to seek out good practice and model it for others and to help us challenge where we could do things better. We've actually implemented a structural change at Scottish Autism. So the CPI will be very much focused on being the knowledge hub and supporting operations, but the delivery, whether that's about community grants, whether that's about the one-stop shop, will be delivered by our operations team, Autism Services. Being autistic themselves, the consortium members brought invaluable insight. And you may have kind of got a hint of this from Josh's presentation. During interviews with supported individuals, they noticed, because they're autistic, stressors in the environment that we were able to change very simply, using things like, you know, let's face it, turning the telly off when nobody's actually watching it, coasters on the coffee tables so that mugs don't bang when they're put down, and plastic pads to stop cabinet doors banging shut. And what was really interesting was that when I spoke to the staff about this, they said that they probably wouldn't have welcomed the challenge so much if the consortium had not been autistic. And importantly, they probably didn't notice these stresses because the place was where they worked rather than where they lived. For me, every time I now think about a policy initiative or a campaign, I ask myself, would the people we support want me to be spending my time on that? And indeed, would they be wanting me to spend their money on that? And the next step is for us to ask them to help us direct and prioritize our campaign and policy work. Finally, I just want to touch again on in-house or independent review. I don't think we would have been so pleased and excited if we hadn't also been challenged. I don't think we would have learned so much about autism myself if the consortium hadn't consisted of autistic-led organisations. I know I now know, although I have to say I don't, and I probably never will fully understand autistic space, but I get the picture about how it's important to autistic people. Through the consortium and through the research work of George Watt, and I'll reference George a bit later, I've got a greater understanding. That said, the value of autistic space will only be truly realised by the autistic people we support if we also have that culture change and that shift of power, because it won't be autistic space if we, the non-autistic staff, control the access and who's invited into that space. My personal learning was that had I had this report way back 5 years ago when I started as a leader at Scottish Autism, I would have asked the board, I'm sure they would have agreed, for me to have an autistic person as my coach or mentor. As you'll have seen from Yo's presentation, the recommendation goes a few steps further than that to co-chairs, but it would have been a good start. What we're planning next. The first thing to say is that we recognise we're on a journey, and some of these steps are very small. Towards accessible communication, we've a lot to do here, but we're taking steps. The first policy that I asked the team to review, and that included non-autistic and autistic staff and individuals we support, was the complaints policy. Because a complaints policy doesn't just need to be accessible to stakeholders, professionals, or indeed our staff. It must be accessible to the people we support, as it's their views that we want to hear. We're also reviewing our website, and we pulled back a bit from the initial project plan because we now realise that the work that needs to be done by ourselves and the people we support is far greater than simply the design and colour scheme for a refreshed brand or the design of web pages. We also need to review and completely refresh and revitalise our right-click online resources. And we'll be doing that probably next year with autistic-led partner organisations, the people we support, and our autistic staff team. We recognise that language is important, and we'll be placing an emphasis on this in our corporate communications, recognising that the spoken word is not the only way to communicate. And with that in mind, we'll also make sure we build on the excellent work that was undertaken a few years ago, which was outlined by Jo in Voice and Choice. Autistic people's organisations, as the report highlighted, autistic space is important to autistic people, and there aren't APOs that are accessible in every area where Scottish Autism works. And they might not be accessible to the autistic people we support. George Watt's early research is powerfully showing that autistic space provides a place for a mutuality of understanding, a space to learn from each other and to help with confidence building. However, there's no one size fits all. George's research also shows there is very little research that has involved autistic people who have a co-occurring learning disability, the majority of the people we support at Scottish Autism. So we've thought about how we might build some APO capacity to create autistic space, particularly for the individuals we support. So we've been funding and supporting a number of organisations. Avatar is developing in the borders, where the autism strategy needs review, needs to be developed and then implemented. This is a very fledgling organisation, but I think it has the scope to really inform and change the way things are done in the borders. We've supported West Calder and Harburn Community Development Trust, who are developing a new museum and resource centre around a co-op building in the village. We want it to be accessible to autistic people as well as a broad diversity of people. So they're setting up an autistic-led advisory panel to inform the design of the space and services that are delivered there. We've supported Swan for a number of years. Their reach is broad and national. And I think what's important to me when I think about SWAN is that we've moved from us, Scottish Autism, supporting SWAN, to actually Scottish Autism learning from SWAN itself. That's a true partnership, and that's where we need to get to. We've also supported AKD, who've picked up some peer support work for us when it was in danger of folding. And what's really interesting there is they're challenging about the way that it's delivered, and we're listening to them. But there's still a lot to do. We're learning from research that autistic space works for many, if not most autistic people, but it doesn't work for everyone. And it can't replace other support that autistic people need. Building involvement, Thistle Services. This is a service that we provide in Glasgow. It's a day service with an adjacent accommodation-based service next door to it. It's a new service, so you can imagine painted white or magnolia inside. And the staff team with the individuals we support wanted to brighten it up, make it the supported individuals space. And they worked well with parents and guardians, and they could go so far in communication with the individuals we support, but they actually pushed out the boundaries in terms of how they could really find out what worked for the supported individuals. So for example, one individual has a real, picture frames distress him. But it was difficult to tell whether it was the picture or the frame. Staff were pretty sure it was the frame. So they found an innovative way to find out. They used decals, which of course you could put on the wall and you can then peel off. But then also imaginatively, they got hold of a projector and were able to project images onto the wall. So if they didn't work for the supported individual, they could just take them down. Recruitment, we've got a lot to do here. We're in a social care recruitment and retention crisis. And our steps in this area have been small, but I would also say significant. We're beginning to recruit around people and for people, involving individuals we support in the selection process. But we're a wee way off, if not a good way off, actually handing the power to individuals to actually pick their autism practitioners, but we'll get there. We've had forums, as Joe referenced in his presentation, from music groups to drama groups, art and craft, as well as forums to comment on local services. Some of these groups flourished during the pandemic online, but others fell away. So we're starting again, but we're doing it in the context of inclusive governance. I want to just quickly touch on an ageing project, which is being led by Heriot Watt University, Scottish Autism, and really, really importantly, our individuals we support. For me, this is probably a real model of co-production. So Emma Stanley, an individual we support, is the co-researcher. She has developed the interview protocol and is carrying out the interviews with supported individuals. The interviews are being filmed by Iceberg Productions, which was formed by and is run by autistic people. Leroy, a supported individual, is the sound engineer, and Chris Cook, the camera person. We expect this research to be invaluable in setting future policy around what autistic people might need and expect as they get older. So whilst this is a distinct research project, I expect it to have far-reaching implications. And we're also thinking about the well-being of our autistic employees. We have an autistic employee forum. Are we really supporting it in the way we should be? Have we really asked them what support they need? We have a PhD researcher yet to get into full swing, but she's exploring the health and well-being of our existing employees. And I think that research and the findings will go way beyond Scottish Autism. However, you've probably guessed that certainly with our Autistic Employee Forum, if those that we've given the power to don't realise that's what we've done, it's absolutely wasted. And finally, I just want to touch on the advisory panel. I learned from George, I don't think they probably thought that I was going to learn this, but I did. It's about humility. It's dangerous to think that we have all the answers and it's okay to get it wrong sometimes. And that is relevant as I think about the concept of an advisory panel. I've grappled with this in my own mind and I've spoken about it to colleagues. Do we have to get all the steps in the ladder that Yo referenced in her presentation right before we start? Or do we just give it a go with the support of the consortium? Answers in the chat, please, and thank you.
Lots of food for thought there and food for action for us in all of those talks. We've got a few questions in the Q&A section. Not all of those folk indicated whether they would like a written or a spoken answer, and I'm guilty of messing up trying to clarify in one case what was required. So having had a quick conflab with KB from the team, what I'm going to suggest is we go, those that haven't indicated, we will put those questions in a spoken way, but if people would like to indicate in the chat that they would also like a written answer, we can make sure that happens, and we will stay online for a few minutes after the seminar formally closes to answer any questions, any written questions that come to us, to make sure there's time to get those responses. To kick us off, we've got a question from an anonymous attendee that I'm going to put to Yo in the first instance that says, do you have suggestions on how to involve people in a meaningful way without people needing to attend lengthy committees and meetings?
Yeah, thank you. As I outlined around our recommendations, this was something that we felt was a very, very important focus. Just putting people on the board is pointless if it's not accessible. And we included in our report some excellent examples from other organisations of, for example, fully accessible, easy read versions of organisational accounts for review at board level. And we also included a case study and recommendations coming from that around modifying those lengthy meetings to have much shorter meetings between smaller groups who might read papers together and discuss ideas, and then shorter meetings moving forward, and also around the that fundamental parity of communication forms between spoken, text-based, or any other forms of communication in how those meetings are undertaken and how the decisions get made. And we're thinking about that not only at the board level, but down to meetings within care and support services about how things are organised, for example.
Thanks, Joe. Did any other members of the team want to chip in, or should we move to the next question? Okay. So the next question we have from Sean McCaskill has said, this seems like a huge conflict of interest, Sean says, regarding the recommendation and rationale for Scottish Autism not becoming an APO. It goes against the grain of what the Scottish APO community says and pushes for in public, as well as the wider autistic community. Nothing about us without us. Other than feeling that Scottish Autism would displace grassroots APOs, is there any other meaningful reason why they shouldn't do this? And Sean adds that the suggested approach seems protectionist. Power should be shared and disseminated. Sorry, I've missed out a few words there. For a select few organisations in the extreme, power should be shared and disseminated across the sector. We're not a monopoly. There should be large service provider APOs too, a whole range and variety. So that's Sean's comments, which again I'll put to Yo in the first instance.
And I would like to hand that over to Leo.
Yeah, thanks. I think, I mean, that's a complicated question, and there are lots of different parts to it. So I would say, first, it depends what you mean by an APO. There's various concepts around what depends, but what constitutes an APO. Quite often people think of as ALOs or autistic-led organizations, but an APO is slightly different. It is historically a form of DPO, which is something that refers back to the UNCRPD, or the United Nations and Convention on the Rights of Peoples with Disabilities. Does it go against the grain of the APO community to not recommend Scottish Autism become an APO? I think is mainly the crux of the question. I think that is one for individual APOs to think about. My opinion, and the opinion of the consortium as a whole, was that because the APO movement in Scotland is still quite nascent, even though it's a lot more advanced than in many other countries, having a big organization come in and essentially take up that space will then take up the voices. And as a way of ensuring that there is a diverse range of voices, geographically and otherwise, especially given Scottish Autism largely operates in a limited geographical capacity, especially where you look at service provision, which you speak about later, then I don't think it's particularly relevant. I would also say that for such a big organization to make such a change is very complex. We're already asking them to do an awful lot of things, which Dory has acknowledged are incredibly uncomfortable for them to do. And, you know, they've bravely gone along, you know, and accepted our recommendations, and the consortium are going to work with them looking at taking those forward. So it's not to say it isn't something that won't happen further down the line. I don't want to rule that out. I think that would be completely unwise. But I think we came as close to as we could, to be honest, with the advisory panel. And if you look at the distribution of power and how the advisory panel functions, there is an argument to say that it comes close to being a form of APO, and that it becomes an ALO. And I think in terms of enabling people to transition and looking at having that capacity built, it is much better to do it this way. If we want it to be a success, which everybody wants it to be, and for our community to really step up when, you know, civil rights in general are under attack across the world, and autistic people fall within the category of those frequently most under attack, especially autistic people with a learning disability, even more so. And that is the bulk of Scottish Autism's supported individuals. And so there's a lot of capacity training which needs to happen there. And change is always best worked when it is done as a progression and not all at once. It is more likely to stick and hold. It requires everybody to, you know, hold their nerve for an extended period of time. But it also allows us to adapt in changing circumstances and in the face of, you know, what are going to be very difficult times. And I think Scottish Autism is better served to look at helping to build that geographical and otherwise APO capacity. That's better for us as a community rather than it being something else. And if it was that such a large APO, there would then be questions as would it be better to be an umbrella form of DPO? And I think that's such a big, complicated question and fundamentally changes the nature of Scottish Autism as an organization. I'm not entirely sure it would be, to be honest, the correct route to go down. That doesn't stop any APO becoming a service provider. There are already APOs that provide services and support services. So those already exist, and hopefully working collegiately with other APOs and with other autistic related organizations, we can continue to grow those. So that would be my answer. It was a very long answer. I hope that was okay.
Thanks, Leo. The next question comes from Marie or Mary, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but are the recommendations for the advisory panel to be a digital or in-person panel? And how often would the panel meet? Yeah, I'll put that to you initially.
Yeah, I would just say briefly on it before I hand over to Dory, that we very much felt that those things needed to be a decision for the Autistic Advisory Panel and that we should not predictate those.
Dory, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I'm not muted, am I? No, good. I think I agree totally with Yo, and I think it's like all the recommendations, once we really engage and we give autonomy to the individuals we support, things might change a little bit. So how frequently the panel meets, whether it's in person, whether it's digital, what reports look like, how we communicate with each other, are all to be developed in conjunction with the people that will be on that advisory panel.
Thanks. We've got a few comments from an attendee, Damon, who shares some of their experiences in political inclusion. And what I'll do is I think I'll invite, it's not framed as a question, so I'll invite the panel to respond if they wish in writing after the seminar to some of Damon's points, but I'll just acknowledge that it's there and that Damon has shared some of their experiences in electoral politics. But I will move to the next question, request for a spoken question from Tonista Kustans, who ask, how was resistance dealt with? How would other organisations with higher resistance to taking seriously autistic people's involvement? What is the role of conflict in this process? Some interesting questions there from Tonista. Yo, I'll put it to you again, first of all.
Yeah, gosh, those are good questions. So yeah, this was very much on our minds from the very earliest moment when we read the tender, because the first thing we did when we read the tender was we got together and we said, are they serious? Do they really mean it? Or is this just tokenism? So we arranged an informal meeting with Dory to essentially discuss that quite robustly, because we took some convincing that they were serious. Dory did, however, succeed in convincing us, which is why we moved things forward. But it wouldn't be honest to say that we didn't encounter any resistance within Scottish Autism, but we wouldn't have undertaken the project without knowing that we had committed buy-in from senior levels of the organisation. We did encounter challenges and pockets of resistance and had to work collaboratively with allies within Scottish Autism who were very on board with it to find ways to work around those challenges and that resistance. But yes, ultimately, we wouldn't have been doing this if there hadn't been already in advance of the project buying at a very senior level. And I did think at a very early stage of the project, and I felt all the way through, that there are many other organisations where there would be much higher resistance to doing this sort of thing, and that at the moment the best way I can see of influencing that is in fact to publicise this project and to use it as a way to throw down the gauntlet. At a very early stage of this project, I spoke about it at Autism Europe with the intention of throwing down the gauntlet to other large parent professional run autism service provider and charity organisations from around Europe to say, well, you know, here's an organisation that got serious about this and really shifting power. How about you doing that too? But other than sort of laying that challenge out there publicly, it's difficult to know how that can be shifted. But yes, conflict is an inherent part of the process. And working through that conflict involves learning, and has many times with Dory, Joe, and other people within Scottish Autism. We've had to push back at times over various things, and they've pushed us and challenged our thinking in various ways, because yeah, that essential conflict is an essential part of shifting where the power is. So that's my answer. I don't know if Dory or Joe wants to come in on that at all.
I I think that's absolutely sums it up, Yo. And the more we hear the voices of the individuals we support, I think that will have huge influence. But Yo is right. What we're breaking down here, not just, you know, it could be any organisation, is long held views about how things work. Long held views about the frequency of board meetings, frequency of advisory panels. What's the role of advisory panels? Can we give accountability for quality to the people we support, or is that something we hold as a board? And it will be work in progress, and we will be as open as we can be about how we're progressing. But the best advocates of that are going to be the individuals we support. And don't underestimate the change that we're expecting of them. Many of them will not have had autonomy. They might have been able to pick their lunch on a day, but they won't have had influence, let alone autonomy, over who supports them, or what we campaign on, or what policies we develop.
Thanks both. Alice has asked, do you know what the training might look like for your advisory panel and supported individual board members? What topics you might cover and how it would be delivered? A spoken answer is fine.
I'm happy to take that one initially. So we did do quite a lot of work around this in the course of the project, mostly in terms of the desk research. The project report contains all the case studies that we did in the appendix. One of those case studies, which turned out to be massive, was a thematic case study on supported decision making, which Josh largely undertook. And that became so wide and broad and important that our organisation, the National Autistic Task Force, has ended up publishing that as a separate paper on our website around supported decision making. So at that fundamental level, that will involve hopefully us working with Scottish Autism, primarily Joe Long and colleagues, around developing training of a sort, support for individuals to develop supported decision-making skills at that really fundamental individual level, drawing on a lot of the best practice that's set out in that case study from around the world in terms of approaches. At the other end of that sort of ladder around training for advisory panel and supported individual board members, we drew on a number of existing leadership development programs, including one by Disability Rights UK, who were extremely helpful in discussing it with us, and another one from Australia. And there aren't completely fixed answers on that, but we began to explore some of the topics that might be covered, including particularly key information around the difference between representing other people and representing one's own perspective only, and the importance, as again many of us know from our experience of autistic space, of that training including making explicit and spelling out a lot of unspoken knowledge that isn't written down or explicit anywhere, which can be very difficult for autistic people to figure out and pick up about how things actually run and how certain kinds of subtle sorts of soft power works. And we think that those sorts of things will be important. We would also expect it to involve some degree of coaching and mentoring to enable people to embed what they're learning in their experiences and opportunities to participate in representation as they move forward. Does anyone else want to say anything on that one?
No. Okay. We've got a comment rather than a question from an anonymous attendee who, I think, in reference to the comment about being autistic-led, says nothing about us without us, or for, run and controlled by a majority of UD, neurodiverse and autistic in 19's lingo, Aspies, autism cousins as voting members, as advocates, service users, adults, parents and professionals within the spectrum, non-spectrum, non-voting support or observers only. Again, I take that as a comment rather than a question, I think, in response to earlier ones. So the last question we have, and the last question we'll have time for, is from Louise, who's happy with the spoken answer. What are the financial implications to the already planned actions and the wider desired actions? And is that a concern or a barrier? So very much in the practicalities here. And again, Yo, I'll go to you first.
I think probably we need to direct that question to Dori, really.
Yeah, that's fine.
All I can say about it, sorry, just to chip in a tiny bit, is that obviously our full report as presented to Scottish Autism did include costings, but obviously that is confidential information to the organisation.
I think it's actually a good question. I think a lot of certainly what we're starting to do now actually isn't really costing additional amounts at all. It's about doing what we do now better, but it's also about redirecting resources. But the situation of social care at the moment, it would be naive of me to assume that you don't know, the people that are on this webinar don't know that there are financial constraints. However, I'm looking at this as being a work in progress. And I also recognise that spending lots of money on something up front doesn't necessarily change the culture. It might help, but that's what we've got to start to do initially. So it's not a barrier, and it's not a particular concern that I have. It may well be that some of the board have some concern about this, but what I can say is the board as a majority fully support this report and most of the recommendations. And some of those recommendations I'm sure we'll still go on and debate. But you know, I'm not concerned about that.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all the panelists who have stayed on to ask questions. It's been great to share all this work. It's the start of a much longer conversation, so we really appreciate all the people that have come with questions and input and watch this space in terms of seeing how things develop. As I've said, we will all sort of turn off our cameras and mics, but we'll stay on for 10 minutes in case people come up with sort of written questions or points they want to put in the chat. So we'll just make sure we take those on. We've had some useful feedback about the seminar and how we can make things like this more inclusive, like me making sure I read everything on my slides, for example. I take those points on board, and all the points on board we've learned from putting this seminar together. And we will carry on learning and be open to that learning. And so thanks again to everybody who's taken part today and all those that have attended. And we hope that we'll continue this conversation with a much broader community of people. Thanks, everybody.